Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Pilot Lawyer Podcast. Thank you for your attention while this important legal information is reviewed. What you hear should not replace consultation with an attorney and should not be considered advice for your situation. On behalf of the Pilot Lawyer and your entire crew, it's our pleasure to have you aboard.
Welcome, aviators, to the Pilot Lawyer Podcast with us, the Ison Brothers at the Ison Law Firm. You're here with us as we navigate the FAA medical certification process for pilots and those who want to become pilots. In this podcast, we loosen our ties and our belts a little to try to have a good time with an oftentimes frustrating subject. As we say around the office, if you don't laugh, you cry. So whether you're laughing at us or with us, join us, brothers, as we discuss the fascinating world of FAA medical certification. How did you like that one? Was that good?
That was pretty good.
Was that acceptable in my sight?
So what are we talking about here today? Head injuries.
Ouch.
Yeah, so thinking about somebody we see a lot of traumatic brain injuries, but just thinking about somebody's head like hitting the concrete or something, that's just,
Ever since I've had children, it seems like I'm hyper aware. There's that word again, hyper. Aware of
not hypo.
Too aware.
I'm too aware.
Too aware.
Of them hitting their heads on the floor, or like putting even when they were in the infant stage, which I'm still dealing with in some respects.
Some of your...
putting them down on the floor, they just kind of like sling their head down. It's like crap. And they. Then you see it bounce up, and like, oh my god, they're gonna definitely.
My youngest,
scarred from that one.
Emma, she insists on sitting in a funky position at the bar stool in the kitchen, and she keeps falling off of that stupid thing. And I've told her
that just sounds like negligent
parenting. Off. Well,
one time when I was a little kid, I had I had a little toy cap gun.
Oh, I remember this.
Yeah, and there was a little girl in the neighborhood. I said, "Hey, watch this." And
you were probably like 3 years old.
Yeah, 3 or 4. And the thought was I was going to take, it was a hard metal and wood cap gun. The idea was I'm going to throw this up in the air and I'm going to catch it just right. It's going to catch it right and my finger's going to go right in the little trigger just like normal. Well, no. What happened was I threw it up in the air and then hit me right in the head.
Like the hammer part.
Yeah, the hammer. Yeah. It was really bad.
I remember
so much blood.
Bleeding, yeah.
It hurt. That's the only thing I can think
of. There was bleed.
Well, doctors, lots of bleed. There's lots of bleed.
Anyhow, so that unfortunately doesn't explain your current issue.
No, that's totally...
that was the beginning. That was the genesis.
That's more of a mental neurosis.
Yeah, I think that was more like...
neurological issue.
More of the weight, all the fat is crowding the rest of my body is finally...
Hence loosening the belts.
Okay, yes, So we see...
They're not going to know about that because we lost that podcast.
Right. That's why I tried to bring it back. But nobody. Yeah,
we recorded a bunch of episodes, and then I put the micro SD card in my pocket and then lost it somewhere between here, great clips, haircut, and home. And I did get a great clip.
I imagine there's somebody out there listening to some great content, just not knowing what this is all about. There they are.
The first thing they thought,
what is this?
Why am I listening to this?
Yeah.
And then they realized I got a head injury.
Yeah. Well, the idea, I guess, could be that...
maybe they have a head injury from listening to it.
Somebody has a head injury, and they think, oh, yeah, I'm fine. And they turn this on. Then now they're starting to wonder,
wasn't that other one technically just stroke? So they were feeling like there wasn't head injury. That was stroke. This one's head injury.
I think you're like the last podcast that we did. That we
lost. Yes, that was
the podcast.
I understand, but
why does he keep doing that?
Yeah, it's bringing up podcasts that we are not going to
lost. Yes,
well,
they're lost to the archive.
Let's say
maybe I'm having a stroke.
Maybe
possibly
different. That's a different episode that is yet to air.
Don't blend the SEO.
So,
if we find that, though, we should air the lost episodes.
Yeah, we won't even name them anything.
Yeah,
just the lost episodes.
Assuming we're still here. So here's the thing: we see TBIs frequently, and really, two capacities, I would say. People that were in the military that have had proximity to a blast of some sort or hit in that capacity. That's number one. And number two, people who are in automobile accidents. We see a lot of motorcycle accidents. I'm not casting in any aspersions upon individuals that maybe have had an accident on a motorcycle.
Hey, I've had 3 motorcycles, but one shows up at my house with my kids, gas-soaked rags going in the gas tank, and it's getting lit.
It is very concerning how motorcycle accidents, I mean, this is bad. It's been my experience. So that being said, can you get a medical certificate? Let's say Maverick from Top Gun. Let's say Top Gun's Maverick is racing his motorcycle along the side of the F-15 Tomcat. And he hits a little branch in the road because he's too busy looking at that airplane. He hits a branch, and he goes flying, and he hits his head. Is he ever going to fly again? I think that's a perfect analogy.
He might, and it's going to take some time.
He might.
It's like that George Harrison song, I Got My Mind on You. It's going to take time and a whole lot of money.
Possibly. So here's the thing. Here's what the FAA is looking at on these brain injuries. So if you had a head injury only, and what this means to the FAA is that, one, you've had no brain injury, right? You hit your head, but you didn't hurt your brain. You had no concussion. Alex, what is a concussion? I think all the listeners know. But
some bruising of the brain.
There you go.
Now, how would I bruise my brain? How would I bruise it?
So if you have a contact...
Does it actually look like a bruise on the brain, you think?
Yeah. I mean, it's a collection of blood.
It's black and bruised.
Yeah.
Sure.
Sure, we'll go with that.
I think the humorous side of this podcast has turned into us kind of making fun of the condition itself, which is a slippery slope. Okay, and then no neurological symptoms. Now, what would a neurological? You're a chiropractor. That has some neurological components for sure.
Right.
What would a neurological symptom look like?
Dizziness, confusion, fatigue, things like that. Yeah.
Okay, so I don't have any of that. So
What about nausea?
Nausea? Yeah, we'll throw that one in there too.
Okay.
What about tinnitus?
Sure, we'll add that one in there too.
How about phonophobia?
Phonophobia. So
what is that?
sensitivity to light and sound.
What about just being downright irritable?
Well, then I've been concussed.
Yeah, so that's so essentially what the FAA says. If you only had a head injury, right? Didn't get to the brain, no concussion, no neurological symptoms, the AME could issue your medical certificate. Good news. You're not going to get deferred. But that's if it's a head injury only and there's no brain. So what they consider a head injury is something like a superficial scalp injury or globe. It doesn't say, globe and or musculoskeletal injuries that do not persist and do not rise to the level of even a mild concussion. So I fall, I scratch my head, I scrape my head. Maybe I got to get some stitches, but it's determined I don't have a concussion. I don't have any globe injuries, right? I didn't break my globe.
Right, you're talking about like the eyeball, the eye socket. Yeah,
right,
okay.
right.
Well, you were saying
Isn't
that
the occipital globe?
Occipital globe.
Correct. Wow.
No neurological symptoms. We just discussed that. And no mild, not even so much as a mild concussion symptom, such as headache, dizziness, nausea, non-focal neurological symptoms such as phonophobia, tinnitus, irritability, mental fogness as a result of the injury. If imaging was performed, there can be no evidence of a brain trauma. If I come down there and see a brain trauma, you're not going to qualify for this. And has completely resolved, and the individual has been released to full activity by the treating physician. You're making noise over there. It's annoying. So
You're the annoying brother this time.
Nobody's listening to this.
if any concerns in history, the AME should review the most recent detailed clinical progress note describing the incident, recovery, and follow-up. So essentially, if you can say, hey, pretty much scratch my head, the AME can issue it. Okay? All right?
This next one is crazy.
This next one's interesting. Now, if you've had a brain injury,
I like how they categorize this as B1.
Yeah, brain 1.
Why couldn't they just say make it B and then have
I don't know.
B2,
so
B, C.
B1, brain injury, 5 or more years ago. 5 or more years ago.
So now
This
we're
can-
actually dealing with brain injuries.
This includes concussion, a type of mild brain injury, or a mild brain injury, is what they say.
So
And there can be no seizure. There
What?
could have been no seizure as a result of the brain injury within that 5 years.
I don't understand this. Why would they say concussion?
And then
Parentheses, a type of mild brain injury. And then another bullet point, mild brain injury.
Yeah, this maybe didn't
Wouldn't
have-
mild brain
I
injury
don't-
encompass concussion?
Probably, I'm sure there's some smarty pants, neurologists, that could tell us the difference. That's why we would send the client out for a expert neurological evaluation with,
A neurologist that's trained in the aerospace medicine arts.
That's right. So 5 years ago, concussion, mild brain injury. If that's the case and you've had no seizure, now it does say there's an exception. They will have let you had a seizure if it's an immediate impact seizure within 24 hours of the injury.
This one here is it's interesting.
High impact injuries, a gunshot or severe trauma may present with few or no concussive symptoms.
That's
getting shot in the head.
It's essentially getting shot. It's like something like
I don't-
45.
I don't know how you get shot in the head. Well, no, it's a high impact.
You had to go to
penetrating
D.
injury.
You had to go to D. So if you've been shot in the head
You're going to get deferred.
or you've had a severe trauma, you may not have any symptoms because what they're saying. And so as a result, you're not going to qualify for this. So if you've had a seizure right after you hit your head within 24 hours, they'll allow that. But if you've had any other seizures, right? So if you hit your head and you're having seizures, left and right for the next year or so, that's going to be its own problem. So now we're just purely looking at a situation where you haven't been shot in the head, you haven't had recurrent seizures, you had a mild concussion, mild brain injury.
What if you fell and some rebar went through your head?
Well, that would be high impact penetrating injury.
like your Phineas Gage.
Phineas Gage or my Circle of Willis. And at that point, the brain injury could still be issued. So what the AME has to do there is gather information regarding the diagnosis, severity, treatment, symptoms, and address all the questions on the brain injury decision tool for the AME. Now, I didn't print that out, so we can't discuss it. But there's a decision tree that the AME can utilize. And if all the items on that decision tool are clear and the AME can say no to everything, the AME can issue the medical certificate. So that's good news. If you had a brain injury 5 years or more, you meet this criteria, you can be issued. You don't have to be deferred.
I'm smelling
Is
a
it
follow-up.
fair to say? Is it fair to say thus ends the conditions for which an AME could issue a medical certificate?
That's fair to say.
with a
Now
head
let's say
injury?
this much. You don't want to leave anything to
brain.
fate. You don't want to leave anything to fate. So what I mean by that is you don't want to just show up to the AME and say, hey, dude, I had a non-bullet to the head brain injury 5 years ago, and I'm fine. I'm groovy. No. You want to show up with a letter from your doctor, maybe even an aviation neurologist, to make sure everything is crystal clear for the AME, that you meet the criteria to be issued, because otherwise you're going to be deferred. And if you get deferred, you're going to be without a medical certificate for a significant period of time. You're going to be kicking yourself. You're going to be kicking yourself because you know that you could have just brought a letter from your doctor to the AME and had reassurance that you could establish your criteria for either the mild brain injury, 5 years or greater, or the no brain injury criteria. All right? Got that?
I think you just
Seem very
summed up
passionate
that
about
whole
that.
podcast in 20 seconds.
Right.
So B2, Bravo 2, Brain 2. Now we're into a situation where it's getting kind of dicey. Okay, the AME can't do anything to help you at this point, in my opinion. Brain injury within the past 5 years. Okay, it's been within the past 5 years I've had this brain injury. This includes concussion, mild brain injury, loss of consciousness, alteration of consciousness, post-traumatic amnesia, all less than 1 hour, and no seizure, right? This still is within the criteria we're talking about. You haven't had a seizure unless you've had one of those 24-hour seizures. So if that's the case, again, you haven't had a high impact, you haven't been shot in the head, as it says here on this, I'm not making that up, you haven't been shot in the head. In that particular case, here's what the FAA is going to want, okay? After a 6-month recovery period. So you had your head, and you haven't had a seizure.
This is all that happened within the last 5 years.
Well, the last 5 years. You had your brain injury January 1.
2021.
And on July 1, 2021, because I've eaten up the full 6 months now. I haven't had any seizures. I haven't had any other issues. At that point, the FAA will consider your eligibility. They're not even going to consider you in that 6 months of observation.
Well, let's say it happened on June 1, 2024. And
I'm not there.
Here we
Still
are
not
on
ready.
September 27th, 2024.
Not ready.
But
Because I haven't met the 6 months?
But
I've been
you haven't
fine.
met the six-
I've been fine.
you haven't-
All the doctors say I'm fine.
You haven't met the
Listen,
six.
I've gone to my doctors. They say I'm fine. I'm healthy as a horse. Horses are the healthiest things.
The
known to
regulation
man.
doesn't say so.
Well, here's
Well, the
the thing.
regulation doesn't even talk about this.
Well,
Here's the thing, though. Here's the thing, though. You could still be getting your records together. You could still be doing stuff in that 6 months. It's going to help move things along. So here's what the FAA wants. They want a current, detailed clinical progress note generated from a clinic visit with a treating physician or neurologist no more than 90 days before the AME exam. In our opinion, you should just go ahead and get an evaluation with the aviation neurologist, somebody who can speak the lingo, somebody who knows what they're talking about with respect to your status from an aeromedical perspective. We think that's really going to help. We think that really goes a long way. Now, not to say you shouldn't still have a treating neurologist, but sometimes having that third opinion, in our opinion, really kind of push you over the edge. So that letter should include information regarding history of the condition, current medications, dosage, and side effects, physical exam findings, results of any testing performed, diagnosis, assessment, and plan, or progress in any follow-up. And it must specifically include, they took the time to put this on a government form. It said it has to have information relative to the following. Any evidence of seizure. Now, you're starting to realize that maybe the seizure, that's a hot button item for them. Any evidence of seizure, any post-traumatic amnesia or mental fogginess, any post-concussive symptoms such as headaches, dizziness, irritability, any changes in vision, any focal deficit. Alex, what's a focal deficit? Dead air. Any imaging performed, and if CT or MRI was negative, any clinical indication for further brain imaging, initial CT head, face negative. That's important. That is important. So that's got to be in the letter. And then they're going to also want records from any hospitalizations for the condition. They want all the hospital records. They specifically identify which hospital records they are, but you might as well just go ahead and get all the records to include any imaging on a disc.
Has your FAA medical certificate been denied? Are you concerned you may not be able to get a medical certificate from the FAA? Are you at risk for FAA action for failing to report your medical history appropriately? Call the pilot lawyer at 1-855-FAA-1215 to discuss your options for getting the FAA to issue your medical certificate and get you flying. We are happy to evaluate your case and discuss with you a plan for presenting your case to the AME or the FAA. Aviation law is all we do, nothing else.
Now, here's an interesting little sidetrack. If you're going to have to disclose this head injury, right, and you're going to have to give them all your hospital records, should you also make sure that you know what's in your hospital records before you give them to the FAA and that you have appropriately disclosed those histories on past applications?
Let me put it in a way that
I'll understand.
Our English speaking brothers and sisters will understand. Yes. For the Spanish, sí. For the Italians, sí. The Germans, yeah. See, do I know anybody else I can offend?
Chinese?
Yeah. Yes. I don't know how to say it in Chinese.
I don't know.
All right, so
They probably speak enough English to know yes. So.
yeah.
Here's the deal. If you're going to be giving the FAA your medical records,
是的，
there you go. You need to make sure that you have appropriately disclosed your medical history on your past applications prior to giving the FAA these records. So in other words, let's say you have a history of ADHD. Maybe you haven't treated for it in 200 years, right? It's just not a thing in your life anymore. Maybe it was when you were a kid, your parents took you down, got you the Ritalin, because you were a hyper child and they just didn't want to deal with you. fine, right? You get off the Ritalin, you go to college, you get your airman certificates,
Get your airplane ratings.
Get your airplane ratings. You're out there flapping your wings. You're not thinking about ADHD ever, especially when you're applying for medicals. And lo and behold, now you have this head injury you got to disclose. Now that you're going to disclose because this seems like something I got to disclose, so I'm going to disclose it, and you do. But for whatever reason, maybe you happen to go to the same place for your head injury treatment that you went when you were a kid with the ADHD. I don't know, but there's a reference in your medical records to having a history of ADHD diagnosis. The FAA is going to see that when they look at your record. They're not just going to look at the records and say, hey, we're just looking only for head injury stuff here. No, they're looking at the whole record. And when they see, hey, listen, look at all this guy's history of diagnosis. Oh, this guy's got a history of ADHD. And then they start looking at your past applications and they realize, well, he's never once reported a history of ADHD at 18M.
Oh, you're just fear-mongering. They don't actually look through all 500 pages of my medical records.
Oh, yes, they do. That's why it takes so long. So
let me interrupt you for a second.
you should do an amendment if you need to before you submit this documentation.
I think that's a beautiful
That's the
point.
long and short of the diatribe there.
Let's take a break for this for a second. Let me ask you a dumb question. What are these
I thought you said we're taking a break.
what are these little things on the microphone? These little like foamy things. What are those supposed to do? What do they
Keep
do for
spittle
us?
from getting into the microphone.
That's the
and
only thing.
ruining
Isn't
the
this-
electronics.
Isn't the spittle now just getting on a foam piece of
A
foam?
replaceable
Yeah,
foam,
I guess.
much cheaper than replacing.
It's not doing
your
anything
mic.
other than that. It's not
Who
like
knows?
capturing the acoustics better. I'm taking the
No,
foam piece
we've done
off
this
now.
before. I think we
Um,
did this on the first episode.
Oh, I'm taking it off now. Can you hear me any different? I think I actually sound better through the headphones.
You look better.
You don't got a bit of foam in front of your face.
Okay, so we've got through that part. Oh boy. Now we're getting into moderate brain injuries. So a moderate brain injury includes a loss of consciousness, amnesia, or PTA, 1 to 24 hours. That just makes me nervous, thinking about somebody being lost of consciousness for 24 hours. That's scary. Non-depressed skull fracture, small subdural hematoma, small subarachnoid hemorrhage.
Every time I see subarachnoid, I think about spiders.
Yeah. Any hemorrhage must be resolved on the MRI. You can't show up with an unresolved hemorrhage on your MRI. If the MRI shows signs of hemosiderin, this doesn't qualify, okay? This doesn't qualify. If you have hemosiderin, it doesn't qualify. So you've had a small hemorrhage, essentially, hematoma, and it's been resolved on MRI. If that's the case, you got to wait 12 months. 12 months. Okay, so it's January 1, 2023. I have this small hematoma or hemorrhage. Alex, when will my observation period be up?
Jan 1, 2, 2024.
Yes. So after 12-month period recovery, here's what the FAA wants you to get. They want you to get a current detailed neurological evaluation, as we discussed previously. It must specifically include if there is or is not any concern or history of a seizure. An EEG, only if a seizure occurred and an EEG was obtained, submit those results, right? So if you've had a seizure and then they made you do an EEG clinically, then they want those results. So they want sleep-deprived and sleep-awake state with activating procedures performed at the time of the event or later for that type of EEG. They also want a neuropsychological evaluation. So now we're getting into some big bucks as far as evaluations are concerned. Now they're concerned that maybe you have some cognitive deficits as a result of your head injury, your loss of consciousness, and so on. So you'll have to arrange for a neuropsychological evaluation at that 1-year mark. And then they're also going to want a brain MRI with hemosiderin sensitive sequences. Right? So they're wanting to see if you have any hemosiderin on your MRI. Then they're going to want all the hospital records, like we said, and all the progress notes from any clinical follow-up visits with your doctor, any other testing you had. So there are situations, though, where if you have a small hematoma, some subdural hematoma, it's asymptomatic, in an MRI 3 to 6 months after the injury shows complete resolution, the FAA may consider after a 6-month recovery period, they may consider all this. So certain situations, you may be able to trim that. You may be able to trim that 1-year observation period down a little bit. So how does that make you feel?
Well, I can't say on air.
Oh, how is it going? So once you do submit it, though, let's say you did submit it 6 months. The problem is it's probably still going to take some time and review. So don't get into your mind that, hey, 6 months are up, I'm going to get my medical. No, you're still going to get deferred, and then you're going to have to go through the review process. And unfortunately, again, the folks in the neurological division at the FAA, good folks in my opinion. They're very good folks. It's just a backlog problem. You got a backlog problem with staffing.
Hire more good folks.
Hire more good folks. You need good folks.
Don't hire bad folks.
You need good folks.
Hire the good ones.
Yeah, hire the good folks, and that would probably not be as big of a problem.
Let me ask you this. Does any of this correlate to any kind of regulation?
You tell me. You're the boss.
I say so. It's probably on 67, 109, 209, and 309.
Yep.
Those are the neurological standards for medical certification.
It gets real dicey, though, because I don't think TBI is not specifically identified in the regulation.
Yeah, that's the thing. It's like these periods of wait and deferral and all that. None of that. You're not going to find any of that in the regulation.
That's where you get some wiggle room, I think. You could say, well, how am I going to have...
Where are you coming up with these 5-year wait outs?
TBI falls into this catch-all. Are you going to is there going to be aeromedically significant concerns? And they're trying to say, well, in our medical judgment, there are going to be aeromedically significant concerns in these periods of time. And so they create these periods of time where they say, hey, you're going to have to wait this out because in our clinical judgment, per the regulation, we think you're going to have a problem during this time.
let's take a severe brain injury, okay? We're just going to take an example of a severe brain injury, which has
haven't gotten there yet, but go ahead.
Well, that's the next one we're getting to. That has a 5-year recovery period before you can submit documentation for FAA review, right? So if you have a severe brain injury, which includes blood in the brain, a brain contusion, intracranial bleed, hematoma epidural. Oh, wait.
Hematoma.
Sorry.
Epidural hematoma.
My thumb was over the bullet point. And it looked like a hematoma, an epidural hematoma, a subdural hematoma, or a diffuse axonal injury. I think I said that right. You've had loss of consciousness. What's the AOC? I forget that one.
It's the amnesia.
Yeah, the amnesia of consciousness. And there's another, the PTA. We talked about that one earlier. For 24 hours or more.
Post-traumatic amnesia.
You've had a depressed skull fracture or a penetrating head injury.
You
right?
had a really bad day.
Yeah, really bad day. I mean, but you're here to tell us about it, right? So fortunately, you're here to testify. You're going to have a 5-year wait before the FAA will consider you. Now, here's the question, though. Since the regulation doesn't specify anything about a 5-year wait, is there maybe an argument to say, well, let's go to the NTSB if the FAA denies you?
Read the regulation for me.
Okay, here we're going to say we're doing it on a first class, so we're going to look at 67.109.
Same standards from first, second, and third.
Okay, so it doesn't matter if it's a first, second, or third. It's all the same, word for word. So the regulation says, neurological standards for airman medical certificates are, subsection A, no established medical history or clinical diagnosis of any of the following: epilepsy, a disturbance of consciousness without satisfactory medical explanation of the cause, or transient loss of control of nervous system functions without satisfactory medical explanation of the cause. That's subsection A. Subsection B, this is the catch-all. No other seizure disorder, disturbance of consciousness, or neurological condition that the federal air surgeon, based on the case history and appropriate qualified medical judgment relating to the condition involved, finds makes the person unable to safely perform the duties or exercise the privileges of the airman certificate applied for or held, or may reasonably be expected for the maximum duration of the airman medical certificate applied for or held to make the person unable to perform those duties or exercise those privileges. So, let's take an example here where you got somebody that was shot in the head, right? They lived to tell about it, right? Given that fact, they were shot in the head, made a full recovery, and now we're 1 year post being shot in the head. There's no history of epilepsy. Maybe there was a disturbance of consciousness, or maybe there was a transient loss of control of nervous system functions temporarily associated with having been shot in the head, right? But would you say we have a satisfactory medical explanation, to explain that disturbance of consciousness or that transient loss of control?
I would say.
I mean, we know it wasn't just like he was walking along, boom, he just fell to the ground. Nobody has any idea why he's lost consciousness or why he fell to the ground and couldn't get back up and walk. I mean, in those situations, most likely, oftentimes, not going to be a satisfactory explanation, right, Anthony?
That's absolutely right.
Okay, so got shot in the head. We know that somebody shot him in the head. Hopefully he didn't shoot himself in the head, because then that would create other issues with
That's correct.
under the mental regulation. So let's say it was just
A drive-by.
a drive-by. It was just, a very unfortunate set of circumstances. So that puts us down here in this catch-all provision. Would you agree? No other seizure disorder, disturbance of consciousness, or neurologic condition, right? So now we're maybe talking about a disturbance of consciousness that, based on the case history and appropriate qualified medical judgment, might make the airman unsafe to fly.
Yep, that's right.
So how does this 5 years then factor in on this catch-all? Where do they get off saying, hey, listen, you got to wait 5 years, even though we know what caused this loss of consciousness, when the regulation doesn't say anything about that?
Well, I think it gets into this idea of them thinking that, it's the qualified medical judgment. But see, the problem is the regulation doesn't have this element where it's like guessing into the future. It seems like the regulation is a here and now situation.
Right.
Discuss.
So here's my thought process. If you are able to find qualified medical judgment, and that's going to be probably the key in all this, is what is qualified medical judgment? And how will an administrative law judge before the NTSB view the physician that you bring to testify? Will they find them to be qualified in the realm of aerospace medicine with respect to neurological standards? I think if you can get somebody that has the appropriate credentials to come in and say, listen, I understand this individual was shot in the head, they had a loss of consciousness.
Or they hit their head.
Or they hit their head and had, a brain contusion, because they slipped and fell, right? It doesn't even have to be getting shot in the head. They slipped and fell and hit their head on the sink as they were going down because the floor was wet, right? It wasn't like they just lost control of their nervous system and fell and hit their head on the sink. It was they didn't see the slippery when wet sign out, right? Something like that. Something where you can really connect the dots. And you can get a neurologist who knows what they're talking about, who has the appropriate credentials, and maybe has some connections to aerospace medicine. If they're willing to come in and testify in their expert opinion that you are not going to pose a threat to aviation safety despite this history, I think at that point you might have some legs to stand on, that the 5-year wait out, perhaps isn't appropriate.
Well, that's a good point. I will say that the FAA, and this is where...
But it'll probably take you 5 years to get to a decision, so...
This is where people get hosed. They want you to have an MRI at this point, and they're wanting to have to this hemosiderin protocol. And as I understand it in layperson's parlance, if you will, so if you have hemosiderin on your brain in the MRI, it suggests that you're at increased risk for seizure. It all comes back to seizure. The FAA is concerned that if you're going to have a seizure while you're flying, that's pretty catastrophic. So if you have hemosiderin in your MRI, the FAA tends to go, hey, there's a 5-year wait. They were just too great a risk. In our qualified medical judgment, we think that this 5 years is the appropriate period of time to wait out and see if you have a seizure.
I would love to see the research that they're using to back that with.
There's an article.
Yeah?
There's an article they claim.
They claim. Have you seen it?
I've not seen the article myself.
Every time we ask for it, we never
Yeah,
get
we can't give it. So,
deliberative process.
All right, so I think we've flogged this thought process pretty well. If you have a TBI, give us a call. There's just a real tree of thought process that goes into it. Got any parting thoughts, Alex? Christopher?
Nope.
Okay,
Don't get shot.
Time for lunch. All right. Well, you've logged another uneventful half hour plus listening to the Pilot Lawyer podcast. And while we reach for our lunch and our little Carter liver pills, we bid you farewell
Auf Wiedersehen.
and goodbye.
This is the podcastfactory.com.